Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeff Paulette from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and thrilled to welcome you here to tonight's event to cap off our partnership with the World Affairs Council, which has been such a gratifying partnership for us. And I'd include in that our partnership with the museum staff. This has really been a great series of events. I'd also like to recognize we have two members of the Ford family here in the audience tonight, Bob Ford and Greg Ford, and we're thrilled that they're here to join us as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael Van Dennen from the World Affairs Council. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jeff. And good evening, everyone, to the 8th and final in our Great Decisions series. It has been a great journey, hasn't it? And we appreciate it. I see many familiar faces. You've been with us the whole way. Thank you for doing that. We're grateful that you've been joining us in person and remotely. I'm Michael Van Dennen. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, and on behalf of my colleagues Erica Kubik and Rachel Brooks, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, thank you so much for being so interested in the world. We're glad to see it, and we're glad to participate with you. The mission of our organization is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that with the help of many regional businesses and individuals and colleges and universities, and we're grateful to do it all together. To change the world, we believe you first have to know the world. And that's why we have the Great Decision Series. We're so grateful to the Ford Presidential Foundation, the Ford Presidential Library Museum. They've been such marvelous partners. We've been delighted to be here this year. We hope we can come back next year. And it has been just a great place and a perfect place because of who President Ford was, right? It just makes sense. We also want to thank the Wolverine Worldwide folks who have been supporters of the Global Discussion Series for many, many years. They've been terrific to us. And today's topic sponsor, Amway. Amway Corporation has been a longtime friend of the World Affairs Council, and we're grateful to them for their help. Thanks finally to WGVU Public Media for being our presenting media sponsors, and the Community Media Center for being our community connectors. After discussion, you know the drill. We have microphones here for you who are in person. Those of you who are remote, you can use the YouTube chat line and we'll get questions to our presenters. And you know the rules. Respectful and succinct is our motto. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Brooke Clement. She is the curator and the director. She's the director, not the curator, of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor and Museum here in Grand Rapids, and she's going to introduce our presenters this evening. Brooke, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. The Gerald Ford Presidential Library Museum has been very pleased to host the 8-week Great Decision Series of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. And tonight, we have the special honor of welcoming General Curtis Scaparrotti to the museum and West Michigan. Thank you, sir, for sharing your experience and wisdom with us this evening. Before I get into the bios, though, I just want to remind people, if you've got your cell phones on you, please make sure that they're turned off or on silent. And I do want to remind everyone that there is a program on Thursday here as well with Dr. David Pilgrim, and he'll be talking to us about his experiences starting the Jim Crow Museum up at Ferris State. So, that. In 2019, General Curtis Mike Scaparrotti completed a distinguished 41-year career in the U.S. Army as the Commander, U.S. European Command, and Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, NATO. As the NATO commander, General Scaparrotti worked to preserve the security and stability of the alliance and strengthen it in the face of traditional and new age adversaries. He collaborated with the leadership of all 29 NATO member nations, as well as the various NATO partner countries around the world. Prior to General Scaparrotti's leadership position at NATO and U.S. European Command, General Scaparrotti served as the commander of U.S. forces, Korea, United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, in Seoul, South Korea from 2013 to 2016. He has also served as the director of the Joint Staff, commander of the International Security Assistance Force, the deputy commander of U.S. Forces, Afghanistan, the commanding general of I Corps and Joint Base Lewis McChord, and the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. Additionally, if that wasn't enough, over the years, General Scaparrotti served in key leadership positions at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels of the United States military. These positions have included Director of Operations at U.S. Central Command and the 69th Commandant of Cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He has commanded forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Zaire and Rwanda, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Liberia. General Scaparrotti's awards and decorations include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the Army Meritorious Service Medal. But, just a few things there. And then General Scaparrotti graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1978. He also holds a master's degree in administrative education from the University of South Carolina. General Scaparrotti is going to be joined in conversation this evening with Dr. Joel Westra, a professor of politics and pre-law advisor at Calvin University. And now, please help me welcome them to the stage.
Thank you, General. I look forward to our conversation. We have a number of things we're going to talk through, and we'll leave some time for some questions from you as well. So I wanted to start out quite broadly in thinking about NATO's mission and purpose historically and in a contemporary sense. NATO was founded in 1949 as this broad mission for stability and well-being, collective defense, preservation of peace and security in the North Atlantic area. We're now celebrating 75 years of NATO. How has that mission and purpose changed over that time, and how is NATO still relevant? What are some of the key points you think we should keep in mind?
Okay, Joel, thank you very much, and thank you very much for moderating this discussion here. It's a privilege to be here and a privilege to be the anchor for the great decisions forum that you've held here. I'm privileged to do that and excited to be here tonight, so thank you very much for that. To the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, thank you for sponsoring it here. This is a beautiful, beautiful museum. I had the opportunity to go through it and take a tour, and it's special to be doing this here, honoring the legacy of President Ford as well in this gathering. As I said, I'll answer your question in a second. I'm looking forward to the conversation tonight, but I was reminded today of a report that was done by a young boy about Julius Caesar. And it went something like this. Julius Caesar lived a long, long time ago. Julius Caesar was a great general. And Julius Caesar gave very long speeches. And they killed him. So, Joel, as we talk tonight, I'll try and keep Julius Caesar in mind. And I thought of that because your first question, actually, how did NATO evolve, and is it
We could spend 3 hours on that.
You could. So you yanked the chain when I've forgotten Julius Caesar, and I go too long. Here's where I would start with that. First of all, I would contend that NATO is relevant and has been relevant for 75 years because it's been able to adapt. You will often hear in the media that NATO is hard to change, that it's not agile enough, etc. And what I hope in the evening to talk to you a bit about is prove to you that that's actually not quite right. It has adapted over 75 years to the differing security environments that confronted it, and in the process changed and maintained peace in the transatlantic. in that process. So let's think a bit about World War II in 1949. NATO actually was formed on the heels of World War II to ensure that Europe would honor territorial boundaries, sovereign territory, that there would not be a war in Europe again. And it was also founded to keep Russia out. And you move forward to late, 1989, early 90s, the wall falls, Soviet Union falls, and now NATO is confronted with a security environment where literally he's being questioned of why NATO? U.S. and the Western powers, the NATO powers are the strongest in the world. U.S. is strongest in the world. There's no peer competitor. And it was believed at the time that there would never be a great war on the European continent again as a result. The United States technologically was more advanced than anybody else. There was no peer competitor. And any war that came up would be short of duration, contained, not difficult, and they could handle it. And they took a big dividend as well, a peace dividend, as you know, and all of us, to include the U.S., seriously cut our forces. So that was the dilemma for NATO in the 90s. So what did we do? You think back to Madeleine Albright and the United States. We began to look at the use of military forces for operations other than war. We called it missions other than war, MUTWA, or peacekeeping operations is what probably familiar to you. But we began to use military force for humanitarian purposes and to enforce democratic values around the world, under the premise that democratic countries rarely go to war, and the more that there are, the better. So in that time period, NATO, for instance, in the latter years of that, between 98 and 2010, they took part in 53 peacekeeping operations. And in that 10-year period, that was 4 times the number they had done from their founding all the way to a decade before that. So that was the difference. They adjusted, they began to do those types of operations, all in the interest of the allies within NATO, who had approved it unanimously. 9/11 happens. Article 5, which is the article in the Washington Treaty or the North Atlantic Treaty, that says if one nation in the alliance is attacked, all are attacked. The first time Article 5 is ever instituted or ever enacted is in defense of the United States on 9/11. They came to our support. Not only that, as we entered Iraq and Afghanistan, eventually, by 2003, NATO would be responsible. I have a NATO command in all of the areas throughout Afghanistan. And they would provide training and assistance in Iraq. They would stay in Afghanistan for the entire 20 years. And in fact, there's still a training and assistance command in Iraq today. They embrace counterterrorism as a function or a task within NATO. By 2008, what's happening? Russia is back. Putin makes very clear in 2007 in Munich his purpose, his idea of establishing, I think, the empire in Russia again. And you see a series of operations starting with Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, etc. And so we've come full circle. We went from keeping Russia out to hugging the bear and bringing Russia in the 90s. And we're now full circle to keeping Russia out again. That's where we've come. And I would tell you today, back to your initial one, that the alliance today is as relevant today as it was in 49, and more so, because we now have a security environment that is not only a threat by Russia, but we have a war going on in the Middle East. We have the threat of Iranian proxies and the Red Sea actions going on. We have Kim Jong-un getting bolder and bolder in North Korea, and always an assertive and ascending China. And in this world we have today, NATO is strategically important to us.
Thank you. I think you got it to the issue of how has NATO changed, how is it still relevant, how does it serve U.S. interests in a number of ways. You, as a great general, think back to Julius Caesar. We in Grand Rapids, when we talk about NATO, tend to think about Senator Vandenberg, and I think Senator Vandenberg's vision would have been quite the same, that the United States is tied to a broader security environment, and NATO fulfills a key role in dealing with that complex environment. I want to ask a different sort of lineage question. In some ways, we might trace you back also to General Eisenhower, who was the first general in the position you held as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Could you explain a little bit about what that position is and how does that reflect the U.S. role in NATO? And then given the increasing skepticism that we're hearing within the United States regarding overseas military commitments, how, if at all, you see the U.S. role in NATO changing?
Thank you. First of all, I'd applaud Senator Vandenberg, who was instrumental in the establishment of NATO and the thought process, you know, for internationalism that led to NATO. NATO is an organization that has the Secretary General as its lead, but it has two strategic generals. One of them is the SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which is the position I had. And the other one is the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, commonly called SAC-T. So there's two of them there. The SACEUR is responsible for Allied operations, Allied command operations. You oversee the operations of troops that the countries provide to NATO for operations. That's over 3 million troops, any number of aircraft and ships and et cetera. At my time, 29 countries. We typically had operations running that would easily be over 100,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on any given day in operation in deterrence and defense in Europe. The SACEUR is responsible for the strategic planning, the military strategic planning, the training, and the posture of the force within Europe as well. So a significant job. Because that job takes place only with the approval of the 29 nations in my case, I think as SACEUR I was as much a politician as I was a military person. There was more Paul to that than Mill. And one of the things that I think I had to grow in, was diplomatic speak. You know, I had longtime NATO diplomats, et cetera, there, particularly our ambassador, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, who understood that speech and helped me understand how to persuade diplomats to accept the plans I had militarily, but it had to be approved by 29. So an interesting position. The other thing I would say to you is that that position exists by virtue of the fact that the United States is the largest and the strongest and the most prosperous of the countries in NATO. It also, by design, pays the highest percentage in common funding into NATO. Now that's important because by virtue of doing that, we hold the SACEUR's position, and we hold the commander's positions for Air Forces Command, Naval Command as well. We hold the operational level commands, Joint Force Commands, 2 of 3 of those, and most of the key positions, operations positions throughout the command, because the United States provides the leadership and the resources in those numbers. This is very important to our country. It allows us to shape and ensure we protect our interests. So, you know, I've heard since I've left discussions of perhaps we should do less in NATO, or we should pay less. We should perhaps let more of the Europeans take command. I was the 18th SACEUR. General Cavoli now is the 20th. And I would say to this audience, that would be a dangerous move for the United States. And it would not put us in a position to be able to protect our interests as we can do it today. We can get onto that more. I'll get off of this bandwagon and get onto the skepticism a bit. You know, the winds of change and political winds have always been prevalent since the founding of our country about isolationism or internationalism. In fact, the founders early on said, we will not have entanglements with foreign countries. That's a part of what's in us, I think. You know, the same thing as having a small military is just kind of bred into us. So it's a constant argument. But today's world is completely different in the sense that we live in a very connected globe. Everything from information, digital connection, commerce, trade, influence around the world in minutes. There's nothing that's local anymore. And because of that, and because of the security environment that I described earlier, we need to be beyond our shores. And our asymmetric advantage are our allies today to ensure that we can protect our way of life and our interests. So that's the way I would present that to you. And I think it remains a very important point yet today.
Not only an important point, I think it's a misunderstood point. As we chatted earlier, whether this is just because of rhetoric or not understanding the complexity, a lot of people are mistaken about that internal budgetary question of NATO and then the more external matter of how much NATO member states are spending on their own militaries for the forces they contribute to NATO. So it's been a goal of NATO for a decade now to have members spend at least 2% of GDP on their militaries. And as of this year, the Secretary General of NATO has told us that 18 of 30 are on track to meet that target. Why is that 2% target so important? And what other sorts of actions does NATO need to take, or should NATO be taking to encourage members to contribute more effectively to force readiness and force procurement?
Yeah, thank you. This is an important question because it's one we hear even in the debate today about burden sharing and are the Europeans doing their fair share, et cetera. So let me start with the 2% and why that's important. 2% is a pledge. It's not a binding agreement at all within NATO, but it's a pledge, 2014, to reach 2% by 2024. They did not meet that, okay? There's been 10 countries some time ago. It's now they'll reach 18 this year. And recently they changed that pledge to a commitment to a floor of 2%. Let me take you back to what that really means. I would say a floor is correct. So the United States typically ran even more. Today we're at 3.45% of GDP with the budget that was just approved into defense. We typically ran well above that up through the 1990s. In 1990, when we took the dividend, we were at 5.45% of GDP. In 1960, we were running at about 8.5% of GDP. And in years prior to that, that was more the norm. So even for the United States at 3.4, this is quite a low percentage of defense for a military that has global responsibilities. So to put that into perspective with countries that are running just at 2% or below, with a responsibility to train and equip a force and modernize that force so that it's relevant for the environment they work in today, an environment that's changing rapidly. I think all of you know how technology has affected everything. Well, it's affected the character of war. How we fight is different. The army that I left almost 5 years ago is not the same army today. And the army that I entered is much different. It was closer to my dad's army. My dad was a non-commissioned officer who went through World War II in the Korea era. It wasn't much different when I got in. So those are the changes. That's why that 2% is important. It's barely enough. And it needs to be more if we're going to be able to defend ourselves and modernize the force. And the same with the Europeans. What should be done, or what can be done? First of all, we should encourage them to contribute a minimum of 2%, but actually more. We have Poland they're above the United States. They're at 4.5% right now. The Nordics recently committed to 2.4, 2.5 in Finland, over 2% in Sweden as they come into NATO. That's more of what it needs to be. So they need to raise that. Secondly, they can also make contributions. It's not only about the money and the force, it's what you do with that. And that they have forces that are relevant and forces that we need in NATO. So how do you spend that money for a relevant force? And then how do they operate? For instance, in a country like Italy, who doesn't spend 2%, they were at about 1.6, I think, when I was at SAC here, and I was constantly encouraging them to come up. But Italy is a very active ally. If I asked the Italians to send a ship to the Med or be part of an operation, I never heard no. They're a very active contributor, and that's the other way that nations can help NATO, and we should help them step up and be more active in the operations that NATO does. Readiness. NATO, during my time, we increased the NATO readiness to have the ready force at 40,000 and a small strike force of 5,000 ready immediately, and that 40,000 within 30 days. Just recently, as a result of the attack into Ukraine, that ready force is now 300,000. And a greater number of that force should be ready within 30 days. That's a very positive readiness move. What needs to be done? Those forces have to be committed. Those forces have to be supplied with the stockage, ammunition, supplies, etc., so that it's there and they can move. And then the NUSAC here has to structure those into fighting forces that train together. That's very important. It's not been done yet, but this year they had a very large exercise, much like the old Reforgers, just wrapping up now. That is the first step in that process. So those are the things they can do that's very important for them to do.
In your discussion of force readiness, you'd mentioned, of course, supplies and ammunition, and we've seen in the Ukraine war the challenges that NATO allies in the United States have had in the sense of a hollowing out of the military-industrial base. What steps have NATO and the EU and NATO member states taken to rectify that problem over the past couple of years, and what things are planned perhaps in the near future?
So the way I'd answer that first is I just went to the Munich conference in February, where all the heads of state in Europe and actually around the world meet. There's over 900 attend. Virtually every defense minister's there, many heads of state. And at that conference, what was very clear was a recognition in Europe that the defense industry in Europe is way behind the need. They're struggling to produce what Europe needs to refill their kit that they've given to Ukraine. They're struggling to provide the ammunition that they want to commit to Ukraine, etc. So they've recognized that, and they've made commitments to improve their defense industry. Second, because of that, there's a lot less talk in Europe about European autonomy for their industry. In other words, buy European, shun the Americans. There's a lot less talk about that because they know that they need our help and collaboration in order to produce the kind of equipment they need. So those two things, I think, are important to note today. Europe has been taking steps, and I'm going to get to my notes because I don't remember the acronyms exactly well. But for instance, NATO has a Defense Production Action Plan to strengthen interoperability and to provide the information that industry needs to make sure that they're producing technologies relevant to our force. NATO established what's called DIANA. NATO's famous for acronyms, by the way. But it is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, and also a fund that will support that, the Innovation Fund, NATO Innovation Fund. And these are two things started about a year ago. They're underway now to not only increase defense industry and production for our force, but to find innovative ways for us to fight, and innovative ways to use and combine new technologies. So that's really an important step. The United States is involved in that as well. The EU, importantly, just recently, this month, stood up the Defense Industrial Strategy document. That too is important because it puts guidance to EU countries that in the future they will buy European to at least 50% out to 2030 in their defense industry, in their defense articles. And by 2035, 60%. Now, I can understand that. If you look back at Europe right now, about 20% of what they buy is European, 80% is US. So what they're trying to do is provide money and guidance to their own defense industry to step up. And they're doing it. So when I was in Germany in February, they just opened a new ammunition plant, for instance. Others are reaching out for their industry, for joint ventures with our industry, et cetera. But this is very important, and we're not close to where it needs to be. You've seen the destruction and the utilization of equipment and ammunition in Ukraine is very high. That's high-intensity conflict, and that's what we've all got to get ready for.
General, you've comforted me that as Supreme Allied Commander, you too can't keep up with all the NATO acronyms.
No, it's the book on NATO acronyms is probably about this thick. I used to complain about it regularly, and then after I was in the job a year, I designed 3 or 4, 10 new ones, so. Just to keep up with my predecessors.
Well, you'd mentioned bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO, and their defense budgets implying some significant capabilities. Could you talk a little bit about what challenges or how many challenges there might be to integrate those military forces into NATO, and also to integrate Finland and Sweden politically into NATO and a role in the North Atlantic Council?
So this is, bringing in those 2 countries to NATO is a wild moment. I'll tell you a few stories. So I went to Sweden and Finland, not infrequently as the SAC year. They weren't members, but they were very close partners. And I remember having lunch, and there was a captain sitting beside me from Sweden, and he leaned over coffee, and he said, "Sir, we're going to be in NATO one day." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Nobody's telling me that but you." He said, "Oh, I think it's going to happen." So, this young man, I ought to go look him up and see if he's an admiral or something today, because, he knew what he was talking about. But these were neutral countries that decided to become part of NATO, and their people supported at like the 85 percentile. In December, I went to both Sweden and Finland and met with their defense officials. And their population is strongly in support of this move. There's no question. Why? They know the Russians. They know the Russians better than we do, or almost anybody in Europe. And they and their people decided, with what they'd seen in Ukraine and what they'd heard from Putin, it was time. Because that was their security. Now, what's good about Sweden and Finland is, first of all, they were the closest of the 40 partners to NATO. When we did our war games in my headquarters in Shape, only NATO members took part in that, with the exception of Sweden and Finland, who I allowed into the war games, not for the entire thing, but for almost all of it, because they were such close partners and trusted partners. They have very disciplined forces. They have very ready forces. They have very modern forces. Their transition to NATO will not be easy because it's a lot to learn. But it'll be much easier than anyone else, and they'll be up on the step very quickly. We already ran air operations with them, naval operations. We ran winter training because they could train our folks better than anybody in Arctic warfare. So this will be not a really difficult step for them, but they'll be able to do it. And the hardest part's connecting with communications, secure communications, and building a force that now has to deploy to help NATO operations as opposed to just defend their country. But this is a huge, huge thing for NATO. I got to make one more point. Think about what Putin did to himself, right? I mean, he created such a strategic dilemma. He now has 830 more miles border with NATO, right? And he wanted less border. He wanted us to get the hell out of there and move back to where we were in 1990. So he created exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He's got a much more difficult strategic dilemma. We now have a very solid front in the north and in the Arctic because there's no hole between Norway and Estonia, right? We have very experienced Arctic nations as a part of NATO today who have headquarters in the high north, by the way, that we did not, right? And when you go to the Baltic Sea now, it's now a NATO lake. And what does Russia have interior to that, who has to pass through all of the NATO nations to get out? St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, and the Baltic Fleet. This is, this makes a SACUR smile. I got to tell you. So, that's the answer to that one. And I couldn't be happier. I was there in December to congratulate Finland and to, give a pep talk to Sweden. We'll get you there soon, and we did.
So as we think about NATO expansion, the Ukraine war, and the NATO front, I was wondering if you could comment on what happened at Vilnius in 2023 regarding Ukraine and NATO and where you think that might go.
Well, Vilnius actually, on two parts, one for NATO, that's where the SACUR, General Cavoli, got the approval for the increased and changed force structure for NATO. And what that does for him, it gives him that large ready force, but it also approved the posture of forces on the eastern flank with respect to the Russian threat, and in alignment with the new defense strategy that we had approved when I was the SACUR, it had gone through. But it was the war that drove the movement in NATO to get a vote to do that. I and SACUR followed me, couldn't quite get it done. Putin helped us there too. So Cavoli at Vilnius got all of that, and now he's structuring a force much differently than I could do it. And he's got more authorities than I had, which is really important too. Now with respect to Ukraine, we made a commitment to Ukraine to come into NATO. I personally believe it should have been a clearer commitment than it was. Ukraine was appreciative, but they were not happy. They wanted a much more clear roadmap to being a member, and I think they deserve that personally. I hope that as you see the summit in Washington in July, that will be an outcome of this summit in Washington, that it will be a clear roadmap, a very straightforward roadmap for Ukraine to be a member of NATO. They have been fighting valiantly, taking great losses, and they are fighting for our interests and the protection of our interests and our sovereignty so that our soldiers don't have to do that fight later, as long as they're successful. So I hope we see something a little different here come July.
Well, thank you. I want to turn it over to the audience now, because I'm sure you have many questions and we want to leave time.
Do you want, okay? I can take one in the front, and I think I can hear that, and we'll go.
There you go, Joe.
So to quote one of your peers, General Ben Hodges,
Yes.
Who has recently spoken about the Russian military, to kind of as a lead into my question, General Hodges has stated, irrespective of the Russian strategic forces, that, quoting, their Air Force sucks, their Navy sucks, and they lost 500,000 guys. My question, General, is why is it that the United States military's intelligence apparatus, along with that of NATO's and of the UK's, keep getting it wrong when it comes to the analysis of the previously, in the 70s, the Soviet military, in 2000 with the Chechnya situation, and just recently in a couple of years ago? Why do we keep overestimating the capabilities of the Russians?
Yeah. So first of all, Ben Hodges is a great soldier. Ben was my land component commander in NATO, and then my ground component commander as SACEUR. So he was the ground component guy and a great warrior. You know, the Russians at the tactical level, and you can see it in there, the Russians have always focused on operational and strategic. And the reason they did that is if they could get their operations right and their ground force sucked, they just had to put enough of them against it to finally win. And we thought they had modernized. You know, so our intelligence, and I agree with, I mean, I was shocked. I bet you Ben was too. In 2010, Putin began the modernization of their forces. So for 20 years, you know, I mean, he had been laying into this since 2010. For 10 years, 12, he was supposed to have been done by 2020. They had shown the ability to operate in ways that we had not seen them operate in eastern Ukraine and in Syria with sensor-to-shooter capability, digital transfer, all the modern technology that you would expect them to have. And they presented that technology was being woven into their force. And I think our intelligence looked at what they saw there, not counting it was a weak enemy, right? And it was not at scale. I personally met with Gerasimov in the course of my job twice, and I had a hotline with him. So I sat across from Gerasimov and talked to him about his exercises, his modernization plans, what he was doing in Zapad exercise in the western flank. And he was quite frank with me, what he wanted to get done. He got an F in everything he told me he wanted to do on day one in that war. To this, I would love to be able to ask him how that happened. But I think all of us always put the enemy at what we think they potentially could be, where they could potentially be, and what we saw said that they're learning. And they're a much more disciplined force than they were before in terms of resourcing, et cetera. And we knew the way that they were training. Now, one thing our intelligence did get right is I had stated publicly as well while I was the SACEUR that I didn't believe that they could do those things at scale, nor did I believe they had the ammunition at scale. And so I wasn't as worried, and I don't think Ben was, about the Russians either. You need to be very proud of your military forces, because every one of our services today, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, have experienced soldiers, sailors, and airmen, Marines right down to the deck plate that today can take modern technology, connect across all of those domains, air, sea, land, and undersea, and deliver force very rapidly and very accurately. It's PhD level work. It takes very high training to do, and we can do that. The Russians can't do it, and they proved that when they attacked Ukraine. China can't do it yet either, but they're learning. Did I answer your question? No.
Okay, thank you for coming. You mentioned, I should stand up.
There you
Okay.
go. Okay, I was just,
We're talking, you brought up a really interesting point about the unexpected politicking and diplomating you had to learn. And I think we all got a front row view with Turkey throwing a wrench into a lot of the new NATO countries' approval. What were some of the fun challenges that you had to deal with while you were in office, and how did you coax some progress out of it?
yeah, thank you. So we'll start with Turkey, because that's where it started with me as I came in. Turkey's an interesting ally. They're a critical ally within NATO. Look where they sit geostrategically. They straddle the east and the west. They're in a very critical strategic location. Got the second largest military force in NATO. Very important to us. And if you look at it strategically again, you'd say to yourself, even though we have our differences, who do we want on our side 5 and 10 years from now? And that's where we want Turkey. When I took over, I had a very deliberate plan for my first 100 days as SACEUR. Most of that's travel, because countries pay attention to who you visit and when you visit and how long you visit right away. I went to Turkey first. And I went there because of the challenges that we were having. I mean, we had challenges within our viewpoints of NATO doctrine and intelligence assessments. They, at the time, wanted American missile defense, and we were not as likely to give them our missile defense right at that point, so they went to Russia. They were attacking into Syria, which we did not concur with, primarily because we had troops in Syria in very close contact, and it was a very dangerous situation. Also because Turkey saw that the force we were working with, the Kurds, they believed were also part and parcel of the terrorists that they were fighting. So we had a disagreement on the Kurds in particular. So, I went to Turkey first. I met their chief of defense and their defense minister and spent a weekend. My wife went with me. We had a lovely lunch on the Bosphorus Straits. I made a comment to the chief of defense that, one of their boats was going by. I said, well, it'd be beautiful out in the Bosphorus. We got done with lunch, and he said, come with me. Took I and my wife, and they had one of their ships dock, and they put us on one of their ships, and we went through the Bosphorus. Now, I tell you that story because that relationship, and particularly the one with my wife as well, was very important. What happened in June, a month and a half later? The attempted coup. I knew the Minister of Defense. I knew the Chad very well. We knew his wife. I called him on the phone at 3 a.m. What's going on? He invited me the next day to come see. You can't, that relationship, if I would have done that cold without never meeting him, it would have been a completely different conversation. And that was influence. It was my ability to go there immediately and deliver the United States messages and influence what we would like to see happen on the heels of that attempted coup. And it was a relationship that paid off for the whole rest of the time. So that's just a little story about why those things are important. The other one I would tell you is France. France, like de Gaulle, it's a great military. I love the French, but they're very independent. And they want to make sure they're independent, and they will drive you crazy making sure you know their message. And then just when you're about to lose your cool, they'll say, oh, we agree with you anyway, move on. So Turkey and France, I spent more time in their capitals and with their, but great allies. And the French have a great military as well, and a very active one. But very much want their voice to be heard.
I think Eisenhower had some challenges with France from what I have read. I would ask a similar question as the woman back there asked about Hungary and their position in NATO and their current political situation.
Yeah. Well, you've got, now, this has grown worse since I left the position as SACEUR. Hungary in particular, Poland to an extent up until this new election, were really pressing some of the democratic ideals, particularly having to do with press, freedom of speech, changes to judicial standards, et cetera. That's a challenge within NATO. And so what I would tell you there is that what I found was to be frank with their leadership. And, don't sugarcoat it. Just don't do it in public. But have very frank conversations of what's expected, and that's generally appreciated. And it's the best way to influence an ally, and it's what we would expect, professionalism in our discussions. NATO throughout its time has had on and off different countries, Spain, for instance, and others, that have tested the bounds of what we would within the alliance and by the North Atlantic Treaty say meets those values that are stated in that. And generally, NATO has the ability to bring that back into the fold. Sometimes it takes, like Poland, a time for re-election, et cetera. But in the end, even with Turkey, Erdogan is very independent in his views, for instance. But there's no doubt in my mind that Turkey wants to and intends to remain a member of NATO. And that's a powerful force. And in the end, it's why we reach key decisions at 29 or today 32. If I could take this one a little bit further. If you think about what occurred in 2014 with the annexation of Ukraine and Crimea, and then from 2014 on, NATO ramped up its response force. It changed its readiness postures. It put battle groups on the east flank of Europe for the first time since the wall had fallen. It developed a new defense strategy for Europe for the first time. The last one, when I took over, the defense strategy was the one in existence when the Soviet Union existed. And during my time, we wrote the new defense strategy, and the first one since that time. All of those things had to be agreed upon at 29 during my time. And there is a litany of very major decisions that even those that are problematic at times all agreed upon, because they know it's the right decision for everyone's security within the transatlantic. So that pressure works within the Atlantic Council.
I'm glad you asked the question, by the way, because one thing we didn't get to talk to, we were talking about the politics of the Council itself, but as you noted in your answer, the commitment in the North Atlantic Treaty to this sort of governance and these type of values makes NATO an extremely unusual defensive arrangement.
The other thing about that, I would just add, Joel, and I haven't said yet, I've got a list of things I want to make sure I say, is that the value of NATO as a place that nations meet and have frank conversations, that's pretty rare in this world. Pretty rare. And not only do the 32 nations in NATO meet there all the time, every day, no matter what happens, it can happen like that, but 40 partners as well, with very high level diplomats and military general officers that can call their capital and get a decision. Do not take that lightly. I watched it work. And what I thought was phenomenal about sitting at that table as the SACEUR is that we were candid. There were disagreements with countries, and they were clearly stated, and expectations laid on the table. That's the kind of alliance you want. Not one that everybody's just happy, but they won't confront what's problematic. They won't call out somebody that's out of bounds. The NATO alliance today, I think, is stronger than it's ever been as a result of what's happening right now, because they're having those conversations. I've been there, and it's a remarkable thing to see. And there's no place else that can happen in the world today, literally in those numbers.
General, actually two questions. One is your feeling regarding the future of America's commitment to NATO, considering changes in American politics. And the second one, perhaps a bit off the wall, is 75 years ago, when NATO was established, the idea of space as an area for conflict would have been science fiction. Yeah. And cyberspace was something not even conceived of. So what is NATO's thinking and activities in those areas?
So I'll start with that one, because I'm proud to say, as SACEUR, we got the vote at 32 and declared both cyber first and then space as a domain. As the leading military commander up until that time, I talked about cyber and talked about space, but we didn't recognize it in NATO. Well, while I was there, we established a cyber center under our command, subordinate cyber centers within operational commands deployable teams, a center of excellence in Estonia that is world-class today. All of that has happened since then. We now have a space center in command at both Ramstein and then with the French on the NATO side at one of their airports. And we're moving at warp speed here to catch up. So, that's all happened. Now back to the United States. This is it's kind of a tough question because what I experienced as the SACEUR in Washington and what I still see today is, despite what you hear, the SACEUR in testimony and on the Hill has very, very strong and broad bipartisan support. NATO is supported very strongly. I mentioned I was at Munich. We had a very large contingent from Congress and Senate at Munich, U.S. leadership there. And I had the opportunity to talk to them. They told me, for instance, that that still existed and the support for Ukraine still existed. That if the bill went to the floor, there's more than enough to pass that bill. The question is not whether there's enough to pass it, it's just getting it to the floor. So I bring that up to say that I think that much of this is not a large contingent, but it's surely gaining traction in terms of questions about NATO, the value of us being in it because of the cost. And I think we just need to do a better job of the administration and those like us. And I appreciate you coming here to listen and to make your own mind up about the importance of NATO. Because we're at a point now where we do need to educate, particularly our young, of why NATO is important. Why does it exist? The last thing I'll say on this is, we constantly talk about cost. It's not about the cost, it's about the value. And the cost, in my view, is nothing compared to the return on investment that we get with those allies and influence around the world. Because NATO acts in the Pacific as well. It has partners in the Pacific. It's global. And that partnership, that alliance that we have is just extremely, extremely valuable to us. I'll take another question. At some point, I'm going to talk about burden sharing.
Okay, go ahead. You're over there.
If a NATO country would be attacked, and then the U.S. entered via Article 5, is there any way that the Commander-in-Chief could intervene, or is that not possible? And then a second question, what would the impact of an American isolationist policy be on NATO? Like, what's the worst-case scenario if we completely pull back?
So to the first question, when Article 5 is enacted, like it was on 9/11, it doesn't mean you're going to war immediately. What it means is that Article 5 will be tabled at the North Atlantic Council, and the heads of state or their representatives will have the discussion on what has occurred and what it means, what needs to be done. It might be a number of other actions other than open conflict. It might be open conflict. But certainly there would be an expectation that the United States would act in concert with the alliance's decision. And frankly, the Article 5 is the bedrock of this alliance, and without it, that's why all of the nations, including the United States, is there. And I would remind Americans, who did they enact this for the only time it's been done? To come to our support and to fight beside us for 20 years in Afghanistan. Not only that, but when we left Afghanistan, the NATO allies had asked the United States not to depart. They wanted to stay. We left, and because we left, they had to go. These are allies that you can trust. They're going to be there with you. We owe them this kind of commitment, and we owe them the commitment that says we understand what the North Atlantic Treaty is, we've committed to it, and we commit to Article 5. Now, isolationism. I've said it earlier, we do not protect our interest or our nation on our shore. I think we learned that in World War II, because World War I and II, there's a very strong isolationist movement, and we discovered that a war in Europe or the transatlantic has great impact on us. And if that was true then, it's absolutely true today, because these oceans have shrunk. Okay? Russia's touching you today in your telephone. Russia's touching you today in social media. They're influencing our elections. They are all about you, and so is China. Kim Jong-un has done severe damage to a company in California, fried all their computers. We don't defend this country on our shore. We do it with our allies, and we do it by being globally displaced so that we have that influence at the spot. And so the extreme would be isolationism and a withdrawal from NATO. Here's what I predict. If we were to do that, our adversaries would be emboldened. And the one thing that they have in common with Iran, Russia, China, Kim Jong-un, is they do not agree, nor do they want to see a continuation of a rules-based order globally. They all agree on that. And they will be emboldened to undermine that even more so than they do today if the United States walks away from that. I think it'll end up for us having to get back into a fight at a very high cost. And what will we do? We'll establish an alliance. We'll try to pull our allies together and fight this war. We'll reestablish the thing that we walked away from, in my view.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for your service. I'll give you the short version of this question, but there's two parts to it. Is China, in your view, or Russia, the greater threat to us? And do you think that Putin is capable of throwing a nuke into Europe or onto us?
That's a good question. I got asked that question pretty often by Congress or by senators. You can go back and check out my testimony on YouTube tonight. I'm pretty sure that I answered it the same way. Here's the way I answer that, and I think it's the same today. I think the nearest bear is Russia. Now, don't count Russia out. They got a lousy military. It's not performing well. They got lots of problems. But what they still have is pretty much the Air Force intact, and they've got a large nuclear force that's very good and very capable. And they've got a leader that has routinely threatened the use of nukes and who developed low-yield tactical nukes for a reason, and they have them today. We left the INF Treaty. We departed the INF Treaty. Why? Because not only had they violated it by making low-yield tactical nukes, but at that point they had deployed them at least to 3 locations, and we knew that for a fact. So we need to be very worried about Russia. And to keep it short, I'll just say the next step is Russia they're not scared by our sanctions. Okay, you can see that. The diplomatic talk doesn't faze Putin. Putin understands power. And that's why we've got to be strong. China is the longer-term threat. China is building a military today at a pace that is eye-watering. Eye-watering. They're pumping out ships and airplanes and aircraft carriers. They've got 2 aircraft carriers out. They're producing their 3rd now. They say that they're a local and regional power. They have no global aspirations. Why do you need 3 aircraft carriers if you don't have a global aspiration? Why do you need more ships than the United States Navy if you don't have a global aspiration? Why are you building your nuclear capabilities now at the pace that they are? Why are they deciding to do a triad like we did? Those are questions we're asking them, and they're not giving us too many answers. It would be comforting if they would tell us why they're doing that, in my view. But at the pace they're on, and with their economy, by 2030, they could have a stronger military than we have, and certainly economy that challenges us. And so the longer-term threat is, in fact, China, in my view. If you can give it a shout, I'll repeat it.
We overestimated the Russian military. I think in the same turn, we've also underestimated the Ukrainian military and their abilities in fighting back, especially recently due to Western support kind of dwindling. I think it's been really impressive to see the Ukrainian military adapt. They've been striking the Russian economy, I think just better than we would have expected. And I guess my question is, what can we learn from that, and how can we apply that maybe in the future?
So what I would start with is you know, we have been training the Ukrainians. NATO, U.S., British, French forces have been in Ukraine from the time that the Russians entered the Donbass. And we had an active training program. To the Ukrainians' credit, they were able to step away from their Soviet training. Not completely, but in significant ways, and they began to use mission command, which is what we call decentralized command and control. That's what gives you agility, innovative, being able to be innovative, et cetera. They were able to do that, one. Two, they were fighting the Russians for 8 years along those lines in the Donbass, and they are awesome fighters. I'd been to the front with them twice. I've looked them in the eye. When Russia was going to attack, I was asked by a reporter if I thought they would run, and I said no, they're going to fight. And they did. They're brave, they're battle-hardened. I can tell you, if I talked to Ukrainians at Munich Security Conference, we had a lunch with them, had 4 or 5 of their wounded soldiers there. They're in desperate straits. They have artillery units that aren't shooting because they don't have ammo. They have troops in the front that they're rationing ammo every day to make sure those who need it the most have the most. We in the West, the United States in particular, need to get our act together here. And we need to get them what they need, because they're actually fighting for us as well, and they are getting into a desperate situation, in my view. But they've got a steel spine, and the ones that I met said they're going to continue to fight. They're not going to change. And they believe that they can carry this through. I happen to believe that Ukraine can defeat Russian aggression if we in the West will stop the limitations and get with it. We should not have parceled out our equipment early on. We should have given them long-range fires. We should have given them help with air support. We should have given them the equipment because they're good at using it. They've proven themselves. And I don't think we would have been in a stalemate today. I think when they had their first breakthrough, they would have been able to exploit that in greater ways if we had helped them early on, more so than we did. So we need to make up for that and get with it. And I'm with you. I applaud their bravery. They had a young woman who was a doctor, had been wounded severely in the front, pelvic wounds. And I met her, and she stood up and said, "I'm a dog of war. We've let go the dogs of war." And talked about, you know, what that meant to her when she walks through her town in Ukraine. So this is a young woman, and they are all in, and we need to be all in with them.
General, thank you for your thoughts and your time tonight. I'd like your insights on Suez.
On, excuse me?
Suez Canal. And the
In
Houthis.
what
The
sense?
Houthis, the fact that it's jeopardizing our
Oh, the Red
shipping
Sea and, yeah, all of that.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I haven't said this yet. We understand that what has happened is our adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, have decided to start working together. And Iran has always forwarded its interests through proxies. And that has continued to do that in the Red Sea. So I bring that all up because Gaza is a flashpoint. It's a hot war, but it can get a lot worse very quick. It can get a lot worse in the Red Sea very quick. Iran hasn't taken the message to pull these proxies back. They probably don't have the capability to fully control them anyway. But as you know, just last week, they fired an anti-ship missile at a U.S. ship. If they strike one of our ships, do you think maybe we're going to war? 300 sailors at the bottom of the sea, or an aircraft carrier with 5,000 on it? That's what I worry about at night. That, this is a dangerous world, and we've got to operate there. The reason the Suez is working is because U.S. ships, coupled with some of our allies like the UK and France, are ensuring freedom of navigation. And because of that, you get your clothes and your shoes and your gas and your oil and all the things that you want that come through the Suez Canal. The actions they've taken today have reduced that throughput in terms of energy by 20%. And I don't know the percentage today, but much that did not go through the Suez Canal now goes clear around the Horn. It takes 10 days longer, and guess what? It all costs more, right? And we're paying for that. So, that's what I think about it. I just think it's a very dangerous situation. We need to be rock solid there. I was the operations officer for the Middle East, so I know Iran and the Middle East pretty well. We need to be very clear to them that, there is a limit here, and if something happens, it will be a bad day, in my opinion.
Maybe take one more question. We have time for one more. Get this microphone all the way down the aisle there.
So what's your view on boots on the ground on Ukraine? Should NATO intervene? And if so, what's the threshold on it? What's the red line for
The red line for?
NATO intervention in Ukraine?
Oh, okay. Well, I think let me be a little clearer. I think that NATO and U.S. ought to support Ukraine as much as they can to defeat Russian aggression. I didn't say defeat Russia. I said defeat Russian aggression. Send them back to where they came from. I think that their red line, at least at this point, is, and that's what our president stated, is boots on the ground. But we should press ahead with helping them get air superiority, long-range precision munitions, which are so important. And we ought to give them longer-range precision munitions and not withhold their targetry as much as we do. Is there a legitimate fear of Putin reacting in a very dangerous way? I think so. I wouldn't count Putin out of using nuclear weapons if he thought it was the end of his regime. But I think Putin's no idiot, and he's a long way from that. He's rattled that saber because it's deterred us. It's made us to be hesitant. But look at the problems he's got now, and the military he's got to deal with it. Do you think he's confident that he wants to take us on? I don't think so. So I think, we can really press this a great deal and let him know that's what we're doing, that we're going to make sure that Ukraine wins this fight.
Let's thank General Scaparrotti.
It's nice when I've retired. I can be that blunt.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Joel. Thank you.